Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about kind of understanding overall muscular development, body composition, and all that relative to strength when we look at all these various strength and conditioning charts to kind of get an idea where people stand in terms of their strength. And what I'm trying to get through here is that each one of these lifts, when you start looking at these 6 basic lifts that we have these standards for men and women at various body weights to kind of determine where they rank roughly, what this really gives you is not so much their training experience, because some people are going to progress faster than others, but rather an idea of body composition is really what this is indicative of overall. In other words, it might not be that big of a deal if you have a person who's elite on one lift and an intermediate on all the others. But the more of these lifts that you develop a more advanced or more elite max on, the more overall muscle mass you're going to have and the better your body composition is going to be. And that's what people need to understand with these things. These tell us a lot about that. And what people also need to understand is that what we know based upon all the data that's been compiled out there, and this includes even guys like Dr. Brad has been involved in a lot of this data showing strength and size. And this is someone who is almost Dr. Bro, almost promoting bro splits and everything else these days. But even he was part of that big set of data with Greg Nuckols where they found that you could determine a person's max squat within a 10% estimate based upon comparing their height to a DEXA scan with their total muscle mass. In other words, it was the most powerful indicative tool. And people say, why does height matter? Well, because the shorter you are, the more lean mass you have on your frame, the more muscle you have relative to your bone, and the more muscle mass you have relative to the distance you move the bar and then your lever. So in other words, someone who is 5'5" can bench press and squat more weight usually than someone who's 6 foot with the same amount of muscle mass, right? That 7 inches of height difference makes an enormous difference in their levers and the amount of distance the bar travels. So they need to produce less force to lift the same weight. They don't have to be as strong, in other words, at the muscular level to lift the same weight due to leverage advantages and range of motion, right? So when you understand that, then it makes sense why being shorter matters. And it's like I tell people all the time, if you want an amazing strength to weight ratio on just 1 or 2 lifts, make sure you don't train the other half of your body. And try to be as short as possible and as lean as possible. In other words, someone who's 5'4" can develop an amazing bench press on this chart by not training their legs and by getting really lean, right? They could easily reach that elite on there if they push it a bit. So where I'm going with this is that people need to understand that. And when you start looking at these charts, it makes sense because they are a gauge of muscle mass through the entire body. Pretty much, if someone is really, really strong on these charts, on all 6 of these lifts, what's the only muscle in their body that could possibly be lagging? Their biceps. Their biceps. That's it. You can't not be jacked and be elite on all 6 of these lifts. It's impossible. Right? It's absolutely impossible. It can't be done other than maybe your biceps. So you might see some guys who are really strong. Guys, well, he didn't look that big. Well, it's like, well, if he spent a year and a half doing 20 sets of curls every week, you would completely change your stance. If he made no other changes to his body other than a bunch of bicep size, then you guys would be like, oh man, that guy's jacked. Looks like a bodybuilder, right? Biceps are the only thing not particularly worked on here. And we know how to grow biceps, curls, and chin-ups. So it's just not that big of a deal, right? But everything else is going to be jacked. When you start looking at the muscles involved, the squat, bench, deadlift, the press, the strict standing press, the snatch, and the clean, even your traps, your delts, everything are going to be completely jacked if you're really strong on those. And what I mean is, let's take a guy who weighs 198 pounds. Take a guy who weighs 198 and let's say he's hit elite on 5 out of these 6 lifts. Let's just throw the snatch out, right? Let's not even look at that one because it's the most skill involved. To be elite on this chart weighing 198, you have to have a 505 squat, and that means with no wraps, that is a raw to parallel squat, not a half squat, not a squat with knee wraps, right? Because a lot of guys can squat 500 in knee wraps who, they struggle with 450 raw. All right, we're talking about a raw squat. We're talking about a pause bench. We're talking about a strict press, right? So if a guy can squat 505, bench 360, that's a pause bench, deadlift 565, do a standing press off his chest with 235, and he can power clean 325 at 198, that guy is going to be absolutely jacked. Now, some people are going to be like, well, I don't know. How do you know he's not going to be fat? Because of the amount of muscle mass you have to have at that height to lift those numbers. The only way you could have a high body fat is if you're really, really short. And then you got to question, how did that guy get that much muscle mass on a frame that small? Meaning, yeah, okay, if you're 5'5" and you weigh 198, I get it. But how fat's that guy going to have to be at 5'5"? And you got to question, he probably needed drugs to get there. In other words, to gain the amount of muscle on his frame at that height to lift those numbers, the guy is probably on drugs. Because when you start looking at even elite, some of these elite Olympic lifters, like that one Chinese guy you always see, and I can't pronounce his name. You guys know who I'm talking about. The guy weighs about 180 pounds, right? So he'd be on the 181 chart, but he is shredded, and he's like 5'9", 5'10", or 5'8". He's somewhere in that range, right? He's not short. He's in the average height range. The guy's like 7-8% body fat, and we've seen him squat 600 with knee wraps. So he's a 550 squatter. Probably raw, maybe better. But, he competes at the Olympics and, the other stuff. Well, he's jacked. That dude is ultra jacked. But he's also taller, so he's, again, going to be able to put more muscle on his frame without blasting a ton of drugs, and it doesn't mean he's clean. But that's an example of also elite genetics. But the only reason that guy doesn't look like a bodybuilder at his weight is because he doesn't have a lot of bicep. If that guy did a bunch of curls, you guys would be thinking he looked like a bodybuilder, because look at him from behind. The guy's got an entire well-developed back, and he's got striations all the way down his back. When you guys watch him lift, when he's done some shirtless stuff, the guy's got striations all the way down his lower back. Striations all through his delts. That guy is peeled. But he's also probably at the maximum amount of muscle his frame could possibly hold. And that's why, again, he is so good even on these other lifts, the non-skill lifts, because, the true Olympic snatch and the clean and jerk have an enormous skill component. A lot of these others are just strength, and that's relative to size. But on those lifts, he's pretty strong, too. The guy squats, like 600 with wraps, weighing about 180. But he's also maximized his musculature. So he's still doing really well, and of course he's jacked, and he's elite on these charts all the way across on probably any of these lifts, and he is ultra jacked except his biceps. And so if you're really short, maybe, but again, that's also, we're going back to drugs, and drugs have their own rules here. I'm talking about guys who are modestly enhanced or completely clean. These are going to give you a good idea of what your frame could possibly hold as your absolute best, if you trained really, really hard. Like, take my bro Nico Ella. Like, he weighs in the 190s, high 190s. And yeah, he's pretty much elite on these charts, real close to. Because he squats 500. He's like 5 pounds short, but he deadlifts over 600. I've seen him bench 315 for 7. So he's good for a 365 bench. So he's there. Now, he doesn't do some of these other lifts. But yeah, that guy is ultra jacked. Ultra jacked. And he sits at a 25 fat-free mass index. And that's the point we're making with all this, though, is that when you look at these and you realize that that's how it works, and then people say, well, what about a really tall guy? Well, really tall guy at 198, if you're 6 foot plus, if you're 6'3" and you weigh 198, to have enough muscle to hit these lifts might not be doable. In other words, because you've got to move the distance further, that guy will also probably not reach elite. A 6'3" guy who's 198 is either going to be completely shredded to the bone, or he's going to have to move up a weight class. He's probably going to end up having to be the 220. And by that same token, let's talk about body fat in this. And this is why we say these charts are very indicative, again, barring some exceptions, maybe the really short guy who tends to get really fat, or, or whatever. Barring that, yeah, they're going to be a good indicator of how jacked you are. And again, maybe guys can get fatter on here and blast a bunch of drugs. But the thing to remember is that, let's say that you are advanced and can't quite reach elite in the 220, and you weigh 220 pounds, but you're carrying extra body fat. Some people say, well, that guy looks fluffy. He's not as jacked as I would think he should be, because he might be 20+% body fat. Well, what happens when that 220 guy who's 20+% body fat, if he diets down to 198 and still keeps his numbers, he's going to end up possibly pushing himself into that elite category. So all of a sudden you take a strong, slightly fat guy who diets down, and then all of a sudden he is elite on a bunch of these lifts across the chart. Well, then all of a sudden he is going to be jacked. So these will tell you a lot about where you stand in terms of body composition and everything else. And a lot of people will say, well, I'm at this weight and I can't get to that. It's like, yeah, because you got to gain another 10, 15 pounds of muscle. You're going to have to bulk to get further up. And that's why you're not there. And that's why you're not jacked, possibly, too. Just something to keep in mind. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.